So, as Lars said, I'm from the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment at Columbia University, and for those who are working in this area, you may know us by our name that we're transitioning from right now, which is the Columbia Center on Sustainable International Investment, very similar. We're a joint center at Columbia Law School and the Earth Institute, and the mission of our center is to maximize the impact of foreign direct investment for sustainable development. The reason that we focus on this, of course, is because foreign direct investment can play a critical role in advancing sustainable development through capital and linkages and infrastructure development and jobs and employment. But of course, none of those benefits are automatic, despite the hopes of governments and actually some of the advice of some of the multilaterals in the 1980s, et cetera, that if you attract investment, that the benefits will follow. Of course, that hasn't been the case, probably least so in extractive industries. And so it's important to find that the benefits depend on the ability on the policies of the host governments and of the companies and the ability of institutions and other stakeholders to find mutually beneficial outcomes for all stakeholders. But our guiding belief at the center is that transparent, equitable, fair investment is both possible and in the mutual interest of all of the stakeholders, and therefore that it's a mutual priority, or it's a shared priority of investors, of companies, of donors, of civil society, and of other stakeholders to find an investment framework that maximizes the mutual benefits for all stakeholders. And that creates a framework that's stable for long-term investment, but also that promotes sustainable investment. Sustainable development, sorry. So Martin actually just gave us this great overview, so I won't spend too much time on this, but this is just a bit about why we focus at the Center on Extractive Industries, and I think why we're here in general. So this framework for sustainable investment is particularly important for extractive industries for a number of reasons. The main ones that excite me and that excite the Center are the potentially transformative potential of extractive industries and the unique aspects of extractive industries as investments that are different from other types of investments, including others that we look at in the Center. One of the most important is that these investments are incredibly long-term, which allows governments to take a long-term perspective about the potential of the industry to contribute to development. It means that the companies that need to be there for the long term have an interest in ensuring that the communities and the governments benefit in the long term, because if they can't operate for the long term, if they're kicked out because of social instability or other reasons, then they also don't maximize profits. So the long-term nature of investment, of extractive industry investments is a really critical aspect. The second, of course, is that these are massive, these can be massive capital-intensive projects. They can be billions of dollars invested, which means that the potential rent that can be shared among the stakeholders, the potential profits for the companies, and the revenues for the governments can both be quite large. Of course, the challenge is to figure out how to divide those, but the capital is quite substantial in these industries. The third is the major need of these industries for infrastructure and for other aspects for employment and for other types of local goods and services, which creates the opportunities for governments to maximize these linkages. Of course, I'll talk much more about that. And then the fourth, which relates to the long-term nature and the need for social stability, is that the duration of these investments relies on collaboration with local communities, again, and local government. That if the local communities and the governments don't see benefits, then the investments themselves are at stake. So this requires a collaborative arrangement. So these are the reasons we think that the potential for extractive industries to really contribute to development is unique among other types of investments. But of course, and Martin gave even more in my very short, non-exhaustive list of the very real challenges, and in fact, unfortunately, as we've seen in many developing countries, we've seen more challenges probably than benefits from extractive industries. So there are a number of reasons. I just listed a couple and won't go into them in too much detail. Of course, these deposits that require incredibly complex frameworks to optimize the benefits are often taking place in places that have undeveloped legal frameworks, that have unstable governance because of their histories or because of the extreme poverty and the urgent challenges that they're facing and the incredible expectations of the stakeholders. There's the threat of the resource curse, both Dutch disease, but also just the mismanagement of the revenues in general. There's the risk and the reality that a lot of extractive industry investments have been treated as enclave investments, meaning that you can bring in billions of dollars to an investment, but have very little of it actually stay in country, with infrastructure that's built just for a particular investment, employment and goods that are brought in from outside, etc. So that it's possible to have, and happens very frequently, to have an investment that's completely disconnected from the rest of the economy. Obviously, the fact that these resources are non-renewable makes this urgent to find solutions now, because the chance to get this right is right now and won't last. I think it's important now to recognize the historical records of abuses on all sides and all stakeholders, abuses by government, abuses by companies, even by home governments in some cases that have supported the companies that are investing abroad. And that means that there's a lot of distrust around extractive industries. This is more so in some regions than others, but even in places where there are greenfield new investments, we're not starting from a blank slate, and that makes these challenges particularly acute. Symmetry of information is something we're trying very desperately at our center to counter, as is Jonas and a number of other stakeholders in this room. But the pervasive confidentiality of the contracts in the sector, the asymmetry of information among the governments, but between the companies and the governments, but also among other stakeholders within the governments, is a real challenge for getting this framework right. And again, these resources can be highly politicized, so there are lots of cases, probably less reported than others, in which home country governments have really added their own pressure to an already delicate situation, pushing on host countries in these difficult times. Companies, governments, and communities, because communities and governments are not always the same stakeholder. So this is just to show how increasingly urgent this has become. The dots are representing fuel and mineral dependent companies, which has even grown in the past few years. I think with this map, if I counted right, if I read right, there are about 45 countries that are non-fuel mineral dependent and 40 that are fuel-based mineral dependent countries. Of course, nearly half of those are in Africa, many of them are developing countries, and that's primarily where I'll be talking about, although many of these challenges are not unique to developing countries. And this is a recent map that I just saw from Revenue Watch Institute that I thought was interesting, which is showing all the new potential petroleum producing countries in Africa. Just showing again how urgent this conference is and finding these solutions. So I thought the background note for this conference actually asked really excellent questions about both the opportunities and the challenges for realizing resource-based development. And I would just highlight a few that I hope will underpin the rest of my presentation. This is definitely not an exhaustive list, but it highlights some of the important considerations for us to think about. The first, I think, is the need to encourage all stakeholders to adopt a longer-term perspective. I think both companies and governments have a tendency to adopt a shorter-term perspective. Companies try to maximize fiscal terms in the near term. Even governments try to attract, and they focus more on attracting investment rather than thinking about the long-term linkages. But resource-based development really requires a longer-term approach on both sides. Again, for companies to benefit, they have to maximize profits over the very long term and minimize costs over the long term. And that requires a long-term, stable framework and being able to show that the investment is contributing to development. And likewise for governments, all of the opportunities that I'll talk about the linkages and other ways that governments can maximize benefits, including revenues, require a long-term perspective. The second is the need to level the playing field in terms of information, resources, and capacity. Again, the disparity in terms of access to information and resources among all stakeholders is pretty staggering, actually. I'll talk a little bit about some of that. But there's a real role for those of us that are supporting the governments and the companies to play in terms of helping to share information and level the playing field a bit in terms of capacity and understanding some of these issues. The third is distilling good practices and optimizing linkages. This is just trying to emphasize that while we do have a lot of solutions, we don't actually understand everything about this sector. And what are some of the challenges, like getting local content right or community engagement, remain real challenges. So there's a role for those of us in academia and others to play in really trying to distill what have been good practices, what are frameworks that work, and trying to find solutions that may not be properly understood. And the fourth that I would just underpin is implementing regulations to improve standards, accountability, access to justice, etc. There are some challenges that really require legal solutions that don't yet exist. The tax evasion one is an excellent example. That's not going to be something that can be solved by governments, although by most governments. It's unfortunately not something that companies are going to volunteer to solve on their own, so that really requires collaboration and a legal framework to solve that challenge. Oh, this is just to highlight the risks of a short-term perspective on the company side. Bear Creek Mice is a bit outdated, and there have been developments in this case, but Bear Creek Mining is a Canadian company that invested nearly $100 million in a silver mine without necessarily engaging the community properly, or at least I should say that there continued to be community unrest, and they didn't want the investment, and so eventually the government of Peru canceled the license, and you can see what happened to the share price of Bear Creek Mining. So this was meant to highlight the costs of a short-term perspective, but unfortunately the story here continues, which is that Bear Creek Mining has filed a notice that they're going to sue Peru in international arbitration, which raises a whole other set of issues about the role of arbitration and its importance in addressing these challenges. So again, as I mentioned, the goal of all stakeholders is a mutually beneficial long-term relationship which enables the profitability of the industry, which is critical for realizing any of these benefits, but also ensures that the investments translate into widespread development for the population. So at our center, we've been developing a working model of a five-pillar investment framework that promotes the long-term stability of investments while ensuring that these investments contribute to development, and that's what I'll share for the rest of my presentation, and really eager for feedback. It's a working model. The framework is meant to highlight areas in which in many areas in which for governments to understand many areas in which the investments can contribute to development and what type of policies and other programs the government should be thinking about. For companies, it's meant to highlight, again, the role that companies can play, but also, as you'll see, there's a role for all of civil society, academia, and others that are providing support to both governments and to companies in understanding our respective roles in optimizing this framework. So a key aspect of this framework is that it's a multi-stakeholder framework that really, truly requires the collaboration, responsibilities, and input of all stakeholders. So here's a quick overview of the five-pillar framework that I'll then take in turn and try to unpack just a little bit more. So there are five pillars, as I mentioned. The first is the legal framework and the importance of having a transparent legal and fiscal framework that's mutually beneficial to industry and the host country. Again, I'll go through these individually in just a moment. The second is the importance of planning and revenue management. So that's the importance for governments of having a medium-term planning, for understanding public investment priorities, for aligning revenue management with those investment priorities, and having effective budgetary and execution mechanisms. The third is looking at opportunities to leverage the investments for linkages, both infrastructure, local content, supply chains, even downstream beneficiation in some, but not all cases. The fourth is the importance of integrated development and human rights, to ensure that both governments and companies and other stakeholders have an integrated strategy both to promote human rights at the local level and ensure that they're respected, but also to really ensure that at the local level, the communities and others in the country are seeing the benefits of extractive industries, which again, is not always the case. Equatorial Guinea is a perfect example. And then the fifth is environmental management, and that's not only managing the risks and potential impacts of investments, but also taking a cumulative approach to all of the environmental vulnerabilities in a region and seeing how different stakeholders can help to manage general environmental risks. So, with your permission, for the rest of my time, I just will go through each of these, and this is meant to be more food for thought. Again, these are long lists in each of these areas. We've done a lot more work at the center and with partners all over the world and with governments to unpack each of these pillars and to do some work in each of these areas. I'll mention a few examples, but this is meant to just show how many interconnected issues there are, but also opportunities and areas for intervention on all of our behalf, and many of the aspects that are critical for realizing the benefits of resource-based development. So a transparent and mutually beneficial legal framework is necessary that enables a stable and predictable investment climate for a business, maximizes benefits for host populations, and minimizes the risks of disputes. And I've listed a few of the things that I would say that includes. So one is the ability to have balanced fiscal and non-fiscal benefits in legislation and contracts, which is a real challenge, by the way, and one of the sessions later today is going to be talking about that as well. Second is contract transparency, which is actually increasing. There are now a number of countries that are making their contracts transparent, but it's still a much smaller number than we need. There's a lot of way to go. But the importance of transparency is to help both governments understand, other stakeholders within the government, parliamentarians and ministries understand the balance of risks and obligations that have been agreed to in contracts, but also to help governments negotiate good contracts by understanding what other contracts have looked like, etc. So contract transparency helps to encourage a fair deal, it helps to ensure accountability and clear allocation of responsibilities. An active and inclusive extractive industry transparency initiative, but I won't talk about that because Jonas hopefully will give us much more information. We're interested in the use of innovative, flexible fiscal mechanisms that balance investors' need for fair returns with, obviously, the government's need to maximize the benefits and the revenues that they get from their resources. This includes, again, collaborative action, not just among host governments, but among home countries and donors and others to help combat tax evasion, tax havens, and transfer mispricing, which is a really critical issue. It includes increased capacity on auditing, financial modeling, and contract negotiations, and increased transparency and capacity around investment treaties and investor-state dispute settlement. I mentioned with the Bear Creek, that's just one example, but there are actually a number. So in this area, we've actually done a little bit of work. I'm going to give you just a couple of examples to show ways that stakeholders can work in these areas. So for instance, on contract transparency, which I'll actually talk about a little bit more in the later session, we've been working with the World Bank Institute and Revenue Watch Institute to develop a database of publicly available contracts that have about 90 or 95 key operational, fiscal, social, and environmental provisions annotated to help non-lawyers understand the key terms of these contracts. So on resourcecontracts.org, there are over 200 contracts that are already available that will enable both governments to understand the contracts that their own governments have signed, the contracts that other countries have signed, and will help other stakeholders in society understand what the contracts mean, and also will facilitate the type of research that we and others are doing to see what models have worked in some places, how have the use of certain provisions in contracts been used, have they been effective, etc. We've also been trying to make the business, so there's argument that the companies continue to, some companies continue to advance an argument against contract transparency or against the transparency of payments, which is, there have been a lot of efforts in the EU and the US and Canada to mandate disclosure of government payments, and companies are fighting that. So we did a little, we did research to look at, to try to counter the government argument that transparency of payments will hurt their competitiveness and their financial indicators. And without going into details of the study, which are all on our website, we actually showed the contracts that were more transparent in terms of making public their payments on a country-by-country basis had improved and better valuation metrics and fewer incidences of social and environmental incidences, which are costly for the companies and have an impact on their long-term financial indicators as well. So we've been trying to disprove that argument and make a business case for transparency. We've been working with a number of stakeholders, including with support from a number of donor governments, with the German Development Agency and Australian government, the US government, and the British government, to help see how to support developing countries in their negotiation of contracts and in setting a legal framework. And we're trying to develop tools and resources around that and see what types of support is available and how that support can be increased. And we're also doing some research, for instance, on looking at whether the use of progressive fiscal models can help minimize the incidences of renegotiations or of disputes in the field, so to understand whether terms like that or periodic review mechanisms, it's another thing that we're looking at, have been effective at helping to stabilize these investments. So the second pillar is the long-term planning and managing the distinct actually component of revenue management, which is different from long-term planning. So this includes really these two aspects. One is including the extractive industries in the medium and long-term plans of developing countries. What's shocking actually is that if you look at the medium-term plans of governments, including those that are developed with the support from the World Bank and the IMF and a number of development partners, these plans don't include, they don't even mention in most cases, by far most cases, they don't even mention the extractive industries, nor do they look at what they really should, which is identifying how the linkages and the extractive industries themselves will contribute to the actual long-term development plans. These plans should lay out very concretely how the governments see these investments, extractive industries fitting into their long-term plans. Including, again, the linkages, what the domestic resource needs might be for the resource itself, for the use of domestic gas, etc. So in many of these new petroleum-producing countries in Africa, for instance, the only plans right now are for export or overlooking the potential to develop national markets for these resources because of the lack of planning. And this is not unique to developing countries. The US government and others also completely lack the capacity to plan, but it's particularly critical for realizing these benefits. A related component is for the ability of governments to identify public investment priorities, which is actually a challenge, and governments need support with that. Again, the US is not in a position to provide that support because we also don't do that. But it's really identifying what are the critical infrastructure needs, the human capacity needs, building education systems, building public health systems, and then what do those cost, how do you get that done? Having that plan, that identifying the priorities and having a public investment program is critical for the proper investment of resource revenues, and really isn't done right now at all. A related component, of course, is then aligning the budget with these development priorities, which again is really not done in most cases, and ensuring budget transparency. I only know of one case, which is the government of East Timor, that has a transparency portal for budget execution, so you can see in real time how the budget is spent. But in most cases, it's not transparent for citizens to see how the budget is spent is one thing, but also how the resource revenues are spent. And actually, a critical related point on this is the management and governance of natural resource funds, which are already widely used by producing countries, but are increasingly being developed, especially in many of these new and emerging countries, and how these funds should be structured and managed, and their governance aspects and the fiscal rules, how they're operated, is really critical to set up properly to ensure accountability, but also, importantly, to ensure that the revenues are invested in the real domestic needs of each individual country. Revenues, but also to enable the investors and other partners to align their own development plans with the government's identified development plans. So there's an argument that companies and other stakeholders should have an interest in the government's revenue management and long-term planning so that they too can optimize their own investments in country. This is just an example. We did some work in East Timor, which is a small island country. Am I doing that time? Okay, a few more minutes, and I'm gonna begin. Just last few pillars, and then I will stop. So East Timor is a really small island country shares an island with Indonesia just north of Australia, has 1 million people. They have oil, and in their fund, they're rapidly accumulating funds in their fund. They have over $15 billion right now in their fund, but they still have some of the absolute worst development indicators of any country in the world. They have extreme malnutrition, very low electrification rates, and they rank very low on the Human Development Index. Up until 2011, this fund was structured so that all they could do was save money in the fund for future generations. It was modeled actually on the Norwegian model, which in East Timor's case was not appropriate because it's one thing to save for future generations, but the current generation was literally dying. The child mortality rate, the maternal mortality rates were incredibly high. So we worked with the government to see how to structure their sovereign wealth fund or the petroleum fund, as they call it, in order to enable transparent, accountable, and planned investments in both infrastructure and human capacity domestically. So that's now been happening for a couple of years. And also, this is a picture of, they developed a strategic development plan along the lines of what I was just describing, which outlines what their goals are for the next 20 years and how the sector will contribute to the development. The third pillar is optimizing opportunities to create economic and infrastructure linkages from the extractive industry. So this pillar highlights the opportunity to leverage both the infrastructure needs of investors, like in power, rail, ports, ICT, and water, for instance, and also their procurement needs for local goods, services, etc., with opportunities to both expand the critical infrastructure that's needed, and there are major infrastructure gaps, especially in Africa, but in many developing countries and even in developed countries, and also the opportunity to diversify the economic base. So what this pillar emphasizes the need for governments to plan their infrastructure, to do some infrastructure mapping, both to understand what the infrastructure needs are of potential and current investors, and to align that with their own infrastructure needs to see where there is alignment. And when there is alignment, the real challenge, one that we've been trying to work on at our center and have developed frameworks accordingly, is to understand what an operational, regulatory, and institutional framework has to be to enable shared use of that infrastructure, which is not simple, but it has such massive benefits when it can be realized. Both environmental benefits, for instance, to not create parallel infrastructure, but also really to not have hundreds of kilometers of rail running through an incredibly agriculturally rich, productive region that otherwise has no transportation, no power, etc. This looks at how you can build incremental infrastructure that's based on, or that's anchored on the infrastructure needs by the government. So it's complex, and it really requires collaboration from a number of stakeholders to get that right, but it's a real opportunity. Relatedly, another area that really requires collaboration is understanding the local supply chain, is developing a local supply chain. This requires both companies to understand their own procurement, but also to make their procurement needs public, and to work with both the government and other stakeholders on identifying which of those procurement needs and which employment needs could be met over the long term by the local government, and what is needed then to get there. That is presumably training, business support services, and other types of agribusiness alliances, for instance, which I'll talk about in a minute, but really understanding what the government needs to do in terms of training and helping to build that supply base, how other partners can be useful, and then having the companies commit similarly to local procurement to maximize those opportunities. The fourth pillar is about prioritizing human rights, again, and integrated rural development to protect the rights of local stakeholders and to ensure that local stakeholders and the population benefit from the investment. This is, again, a response to the fact that even in cases in which the government can effectively manage the resources, like in the case of East Timor, there's a need for and a right of the local population to benefit and to see the direct benefits from the resources. So opportunities here include, for instance, developing local development plans, especially in producing regions, but not exclusively in producing regions, to help local governments understand their own public needs, and most of those needs have to be addressed by the national government, not by companies that are operating in the region. So things like public health systems, schools, etc., those have to be developed by the national government and the regional government. And then this creates the opportunity for companies to align their corporate social responsibility strategies and other community engagement strategies with the identified needs and strategies of the local community and of the government. Without this, and without public services like health clinics, schools, water supply infrastructure, and others, companies, CSR programs, and community are largely unsustainable and completely disconnected from national grids. Which is often what happens, because governments and communities expect companies that come in to provide all of those services, which is really not the right model in the long term to ensure long-term development. But there's a real opportunity here, as we actually worked with Anglo Ashanti and a couple other partners in Guinea and Tanzania to work with companies, with the local governments, and with the national governments to develop this local framework and see how all the stakeholders can play a role. There are also opportunities to develop agribusiness alliances among not just extractive industry companies, but other companies that are operating in the region to make it make sense to support local developers. Sometimes it doesn't make sense for one company alone to support smallholder agriculture, for instance. But with an alliance, it's possible to create economies of scale and to build the types of infrastructure and support services to enable local level development. This is primarily, of course, in agricultural producing regions. And then, of course, governments and companies both need strategies to protect and promote the human rights of affected communities. And this is a whole topic. I'm sorry to breeze by it, but that's obviously a really critical aspect of ensuring the protection of human rights. And finally, the fifth pillar looks at ways for stakeholders again to manage the environmental and climate risks. And again, this includes two dimensions. One is the management of the actual risks and impact from a particular investment. And in this respect, I think one of the things we emphasize in this pillar is that it's not just about individual companies explaining or understanding the particular risks and impacts of their own investment, but also how multiple companies and other stakeholders can help governments to plan for and anticipate the cumulative environmental impacts of a number of different investments, which is not necessarily the sum of its parts. And this should be done even before investments are made, but certainly early enough in the planning process to be able to adjust plans accordingly, which is very, very rarely the case, unfortunately. And the second is that the second component of this pillar is that most of these investments take place in regions that have pre-existing environmental vulnerabilities. Especially if they're dependent on rainfall-fed agriculture, for instance, or if they're otherwise particularly vulnerable to climate change risks, drought, etc. So this is emphasizing the need for companies that have the resources, other stakeholders who have the technical expertise, and others to work, especially in these regions, to address those other pre-existing environmental vulnerabilities, not least because they can be exacerbated by extractive industries, but also because, like with urgent development needs and poverty, they're a very real risk in these areas and require multi-stakeholder attention. So just in conclusion, we think that collaborative efforts to leverage extractive industries for development in new and existing producing companies should reflect at least some of the following, trying to synthesize all of that. First of all, that the responsibilities for resource-based development are shared among all of these stakeholders. They're shared among companies, national governments, local governments. There's a critical role for the civil society, donors, NGOs, and academia. That corporate social responsibility has to be partnered with good governance. And this also doesn't mean that both have to happen, or that both should happen simultaneously, which they should, but that they really need to happen in coordination and with each other. That they shouldn't be done parallel, but that companies and governments really should work together with the collaboration of a number of other stakeholders to maximize these frameworks. As you can see, a lot of them really rely on that dialogue and a shared understanding between companies and governments, among others. And then at each stage in this process, planning, transparency, and cooperation is critical for realizing those mutual benefits. So that again, thank you. And I don't know if I have. Okay.